Hello there. Tonight we're going to set aside the noise of the day and step quietly into history. Not the kind filled with battles, crowns, or dramatic victories. No. Tonight, the history we'll explore will be softer, slower. We'll talk about the Egyptians, not their pyramids or their pharaohs, but something far more ordinary. The cats that curled in their courtyards, the dogs that trotted at their heels, the rituals, the offerings, the endless routines that turned everyday animals into living symbols of the divine. This is not a fast story. It is a long one. A story that drifts like the Nile itself, steady, repetitive, unhurried. So, get comfortable. Let your breath slow down. And as you listen, let the weight of each detail gently carry you toward rest.
The story of how ancient Egyptians came to revere cats is one that can only be understood by first slowing down, pausing, and looking carefully at the world in which they lived. And if we take the time to imagine ourselves not in the modern age, but thousands of years ago, we will see that the environment, the land itself, and the animals that shared that land with humans played a central role in shaping beliefs, habits, and even entire mythologies. Egypt, as you may know, was defined by the Nile River, and it is important, so very important, to remember that the Nile did not simply exist as a river, but as a lifeline, as a gentle yet powerful thread that stitched together the daily rhythms of life. Each year the river would flood, and those floods left behind fertile soil, and on that soil grain would grow, and where grain grew, mice would gather, and where mice gathered, cats would come. And here is where we can begin, but only after noting that every single step in this chain mattered, and mattered deeply. And if you picture for a moment a stalk of grain swaying gently in the dry desert breeze, then imagine a mouse nibbling at its base, and then imagine a sleek cat crouching patiently in the shadows, then you already have the faint outlines of why cats were not just animals to the Egyptians, but protectors, allies, and perhaps even divine companions. The detail worth lingering on here is not simply that cats ate mice, but that mice threatened the very food supply that sustained entire villages. And so a cat was not merely a hunter of rodents, but a silent guardian of bread, of life, and of continuity. If you hold in your mind the long, slow process of planting, tending, and harvesting grain, the aching backs of farmers, the creak of wooden tools, the endless hours under a blistering sun, then you realize how devastating even small losses could be. And suddenly, the role of a cat takes on much greater significance. It is easy to think of a cat as small, perhaps even fragile, but when it comes to safeguarding survival, size is not the only measure of power. Cats were agile, nocturnal, and relentless. And in a land where the difference between abundance and famine could hinge on the presence of a few prowling guardians, their value became not only practical, but symbolic. Now, when speaking of symbolism, one must understand that the Egyptians were not quick in their thinking, or rather, their culture did not rush ideas into existence. Instead, beliefs built layer upon layer, slowly, patiently, as if each new thought were a stone placed carefully upon another in the construction of a grand temple. Cats began as hunters, yes, but with each generation their presence in the household took on new layers of meaning. The gentle way a cat might curl at the foot of a bed, the stillness of its form as it basked in a shaft of sunlight, the unblinking stare of its golden eyes in the dimness of evening, all these qualities seemed almost otherworldly. Egyptians saw divinity everywhere, in the flooding of the river, in the rising of the sun, in the coolness of night breezes, and so it was only natural that the quiet, mysterious, and yet deeply useful nature of cats should also be touched by divine association. But before we leap too quickly into gods and temples, we must, as promised, linger on the smallest details, for it is those details that give texture and weight to the story. Imagine, if you will, the simple clay house of a farmer, its walls sun-baked and slightly cracked, the floor swept smooth by countless bare feet. Within this home, stored jars of grain stand along one side, sealed carefully with mud stoppers. But even so, a few cracks may allow the scent of grain to seep out, drawing rodents in the night. Picture the scratching of tiny claws at the edge of a jar, the faint rustle of fur in the silence, and then, suddenly, the soft but deadly pounce of a cat, a flash of movement in the dim light of a small oil lamp. To the farmer, this is not simply an act of nature, it is salvation. The jar remains safe. The family has food for another day. And so when morning comes and the cat sits calmly, licking its paws as though nothing had happened, the family may stroke its back, offer it a bit of leftover fish, and whisper thanks in their hearts. Such repeated nightly dramas built affection, respect, and eventually reverence. And it is no accident that this reverence grew strongest in a land like Egypt, where stability and continuity were prized above all, where dynasties lasted centuries, and where the cycle of the Nile was measured with awe. Cats were stability in miniature. It is also worth noting, in painstaking detail, that cats possessed traits that were particularly striking to Egyptians. Their eyes, for example, reflected light in the darkness, seeming to glow with an inner fire. This glow was not merely biological to the ancient observer, it was mystical. To see eyes shining in the night, to feel their gaze when all else was shadow, suggested a being in touch with unseen realms. Their sleek bodies, so flexible and so quiet, made them appear as though they could slip between worlds, gliding from the physical to the spiritual without difficulty. Their tendency to sleep for long hours, then awaken suddenly with bursts of energy, paralleled cycles of death and rebirth, slumber and awakening, a theme central to Egyptian belief in the afterlife. And let us not forget their sounds, the purring vibration, soothing and mysterious, or the sharp cry of a cat at night, echoing eerily through narrow streets. These sounds were not ignored, they were interpreted, woven into the tapestry of meaning. Now, while cats were becoming increasingly esteemed, we must pause to note that dogs held a different role. Dogs were associated with hunting, with guarding, and later with the god Anubis, guardian of the dead. But where dogs were loud, energetic, and outwardly useful in the open field, cats were subtle, silent, and domestic. This difference meant that cats were not rivals to dogs, but companions with distinct functions. And it is in the domestic sphere, where life was most fragile, that cats excelled. Day after day, year after year, their presence at the hearth, their guardianship of grain, and their quiet companionship turned them from mere animals into household deities. The Egyptians had a word for cat, mew, thought to be derived from the sound cats themselves make, a word that suggests intimacy, closeness, and familiarity. It's worth lingering here. A culture that names an animal not by its function, but by its voice, is a culture that feels connection rather than distance.
As centuries passed, this reverence deepened. Cats became associated with the goddess Bastet, who began as a fierce lioness figure and over time softened into the image of a domestic cat, a protector of homes, women, and children. But before diving into the temples and statues, it is important, once again, to slow down and think about why such a transformation occurred. It was not random nor sudden, but a reflection of lived experience. For countless families, cats were daily presences, protectors of food, symbols of grace. When ordinary people saw in their cats both power and tenderness, it made sense that the divine would take on such a form. And so temples to Bastet rose, with statues of cats in bronze and stone, with mummified cats offered as sacred gifts, with prayers whispered for protection. This was not merely religion. It was an extension of daily gratitude, elevated to cosmic scale.
But let us not hurry. Let us consider, slowly, what it meant to mummify a cat. Imagine the deliberate process of wrapping linen, the careful placement of amulets, the ritual words spoken. Each mummified cat represented not only devotion, but the belief that the spirit of the animal could intercede, could act as a bridge to the divine. And when thousands upon thousands of cat mummies are discovered, it tells us that this was no rare or elite practice. It was widespread, deeply ingrained. Why? Because every household, from the humblest to the grandest, knew the value of a cat. The temples themselves became centers of feline reverence, and visitors from across Egypt would come, bearing offerings. But if we picture these temples only as grand stone structures, we miss the quieter details. The rows of votive statues, each one carefully polished, the smell of incense curling upward in slow spirals, the murmur of prayers blending with the occasional sound of a cat's meow echoing through the halls. It is in these little sensory details that the reverence becomes real. And yet what is most striking is not only that cats were worshipped, but that harming a cat was considered a grave offense, punishable even by death in some accounts. This is a testament not only to their sacred status, but to the emotional bond people felt. The death of a cat could bring mourning rituals, with shaved eyebrows as a sign of grief, a gesture that might seem small, but tells us volumes about attachment. We might pause again here and reflect on why such depth of feeling arose. It was not simply practicality, nor only religion, but a merging of both. Cats were useful, yes, but also mysterious, affectionate yet independent, familiar yet strange. They embodied contradictions that fascinated humans, and the Egyptians, ever attentive to the balance of opposites, life and death, order and chaos, light and dark, found in cats a living embodiment of harmony. The story could end here with cats enthroned in temples, but to truly understand, we must broaden the lens ever so slowly to consider Egypt's place in the wider ancient world. Traders, travelers, and conquerors all carried with them stories of Egypt's cats, and soon the feline reputation spread. Cats were gifted, smuggled, and eventually found homes in Greece, Rome, and beyond, always carrying with them an aura of sacredness. But nowhere were they as deeply woven into the fabric of life as in Egypt. We can say that the worship of cats was not a quirk, not a superstition plucked from nowhere, but the natural flowering of centuries of coexistence, of gratitude turned into reverence, of practicality elevated into mythology. To understand why Egyptians worshipped cats, you must picture not just the temples and statues, but the countless small moments in humble homes, the quiet rustle of a mouse in the dark, the sudden pounce of a sleek hunter, and the sigh of relief from a weary farmer. It is in those tiny, repeated moments that reverence was born, grew, and endured for millennia.
In order to truly imagine what it meant for the ancient Egyptians to live side by side with cats, one must first step into the small, sun-baked world of the typical Egyptian household, a world that may sound simple at first glance, but is full of tiny details that deserve long and deliberate attention. Details that reveal why the presence of a cat mattered so much, and why the rhythms of daily life were subtly shaped by the gentle sound of paws moving across clay floors. Consider, for a moment, a modest farmer's dwelling near the banks of the Nile, its walls made of mud brick, which, when freshly shaped, would have been damp, sticky, and cool, but after being dried in the sun for days or even weeks, turned hard, cracked, and faintly dusty. The walls were not perfectly straight, not perfectly smooth. They bore the uneven marks of fingers and simple tools, the imperfections that told you this was a home shaped by hand rather than by machine. The floor, too, was compacted earth, perhaps sprinkled with reeds to soften the field beneath bare feet. And here is where the cat walked, tail raised, eyes bright, scanning the corners where insects scurried, and where, if fortune placed them badly, mice might try to creep. The jars of grain, tall and rounded with narrow necks that flared slightly at the top, lined the side of the main room. They were not decorated for beauty, but for practicality. Yet the very clay of which they were made sometimes retained faint ripples from the potter's wheel, tiny ridges that fingers could feel when brushing past. The lids, simple plugs of clay or woven reeds sealed with mud, were meant to keep pests out, but no seal was perfect, and the scent of barley or emmer wheat sometimes drifted into the air, especially when the jar was opened and closed during the day. It is here, in this practical, ordinary corner of life, that the cat's role became visible, because when night fell and the household grew quiet, the smallest scratching noises at the base of a jar could be enough to bring the sleek hunter to life. The cat, who might have spent the heat of the afternoon sprawled lazily on a reed mat in the patch of sunlight that angled in through the doorway, would now rise with deliberate grace, stretching its body in a long arc, claws extending briefly before moving silently across the floor. Children in the household would often notice this behavior, and while adults might take it as routine, children tended to watch with wide eyes, marveling at the way the cat's shoulders rolled beneath its fur, the way its tail twitched in concentration. For them, the cat was not only a hunter, but a playmate, a presence that turned ordinary evenings into small performances. Sometimes in the daytime, children would try to mimic the cat, crouching low, attempting to pounce upon one another, laughing when they failed to capture the same elegance. The bond formed in these moments was simple, yet profound, and though historians today may list practical reasons for feline reverence, one should not overlook the emotional texture of everyday life, where a child might fall asleep with a cat curled against their side, its purring blending with the quiet sounds of the household settling into night. Meals were another time when cats made their presence known. A typical family meal might involve bread, perhaps some fish if the day had been fortunate, or vegetables stewed with herbs. The aroma of grilling fish, its skin crackling slightly in the small household oven or over the hearth, would draw not only human appetites but feline attention. A cat might sit, poised with almost regal patience, eyes fixed on the hands that prepared or distributed food. Families often shared scraps, tossing small morsels to the floor where the cat could lap them up. And this ritual of feeding was not considered wasteful, but natural. To deny the cat was unthinkable, for just as it guarded their grain, so too did the family guard its contentment. The sound of a cat crunching a small bone or licking at a piece of fish added another layer to the chorus of mealtime noises. The clatter of pottery bowls, the murmur of voices, the soft shuffle of reed sandals on the floor. During the hotter hours of midday, when work paused and people retreated indoors to escape the blistering sun, cats also sought comfort in the shaded corners of the house. One might find a cat stretched across a cool threshold, belly pressed against the slightly damp earth, or curled into the curve of a basket. The way cats arrange themselves, folding their paws neatly beneath their chests or curling into a tight circle, fascinated observers, and over time, such postures took on symbolic meanings. To rest like a cat was to embody tranquility, to embody balance between alertness and ease. The stillness of a dozing cat became almost meditative, a living image of peace amid the hum of flies and the distant sound of water wheels creaking along the Nile. If we shift our view slightly from the farmer's home to that of a craftsman, a potter perhaps, or a weaver, we see similar patterns. The potter's workshop, filled with clay dust and the smell of wet earth, might seem inhospitable to a cat, but in truth, it offered many hiding places, warm spots near the kiln, and ample opportunities to chase pests that nibbled at baskets of straw or stored food. The weaver's household, with its looms strung with threads of flax, provided dangling strings that must have delighted more than one curious feline.
Imagine a weaver's child laughing as the cat batted at loose threads, while the adult scolded gently, not wanting the work disturbed, but unable to resist the smile. These small, ordinary interactions contributed to a sense that cats were not only protectors, but companions, woven into the rhythm of labor and leisure.
In wealthier homes, cats enjoyed different roles, though still central ones. A noble household with painted walls, more elaborate furniture, and servants moving about might keep cats as cherished pets rather than merely practical hunters. They could wear collars of leather, or even be adorned with small ornaments of faience or bronze. Guests might remark upon their beauty, the sheen of their coats, the elegance of their movement across polished floors. To own a graceful cat was to display refinement, to demonstrate a household's alignment with ideals of balance, poise, and divine favor. Yet even in these grander settings, the essential behaviors remain the same. The cat's watchful gaze at twilight, its contented purring by the hearth, its sudden burst of energy as it pursued a beetle or mouse. Across social classes, the essence of feline presence was unchanged. Priests, too, valued cats in their own daily lives. Within temple complexes, cats wandered freely, often fed by those who served the gods. They were considered sacred, yes, but also familiar. Their everyday behavior a reminder that the divine was not far removed from the mundane. A priest might pause in his duties to stroke the head of a temple cat, murmuring a quiet word of blessing. The animal, in turn, might close its eyes, leaning into the touch, embodying both independence and acceptance. In this way, the daily rhythms of devotion were interlaced with the small comforts of companionship, making the cat not an abstract symbol, but a living presence in the sacred spaces of Egypt. The way families mourned their cats also reveals how deeply embedded they were in daily life. When a cat died, households often grieved sincerely. The shaving of eyebrows as a sign of mourning was not only a ritual act, but an outward expression of loss, an acknowledgement that the home felt emptier without the familiar sound of paws, the watchful eyes, the comforting warmth. Such gestures show us that the bond was not distant or purely symbolic, but deeply felt. The texture of household life included affection, sorrow, and remembrance, all centered on these quiet companions. The connection extended into how Egyptians thought about teaching and learning. Children grew up observing cats, learning patience from their hunting, balance from their movements, attentiveness from their stillness. Parents might use the cat as an example, telling their child to wait as patiently as the cat waits, or to move as gracefully as the cat moves. Lessons embedded in everyday observations turned the cat into not only a guardian of food, but a teacher of virtues. Even the architecture of homes subtly reflected their presence. Small alcoves or ledges offered perches where cats could sit and watch. Open doorways allowed them to slip easily between indoor and outdoor spaces. The very permeability of Egyptian houses, with their courtyards and rooftops, suited the feline nature, giving them vantage points and places of retreat. One can imagine the quiet figure of a cat perched on a sun-warmed wall, tail twitching slowly as it surveys the courtyard below, eyes half closed yet alert. This image, repeated countless times across countless homes, built a collective sense of the cat as both watchful and serene, both ordinary and extraordinary. The seasons of Egypt also shaped daily life with cats. During the inundation, when fields lay underwater and families turned more toward indoor crafts and preparations, cats became central to household activity, curling beside workers, chasing insects stirred by the dampness, bringing amusement during long indoor hours. During harvest, when granaries filled and mice grew bold, cats worked tirelessly, their role in safeguarding provisions most visible. And during the hotter, dry seasons, when rest was crucial, cats modeled the art of finding comfort, sprawling in shade, conserving energy, and teaching through their very bodies how to endure the unrelenting sun. We cannot forget to linger on the smallest gestures, a mother stroking a cat's fur as she kneads dough, absent-minded yet affectionate, a father tossing a scrap of fish skin onto the floor with a half smile, a child laughing at a sudden playful leap. These details, though easily overlooked, formed the fabric of what life with cats truly meant. It was not a matter of occasional interaction, but of constant presence, woven so deeply into the texture of daily routine that to imagine an Egyptian household without a cat feels incomplete. And so, as we extend this picture across the thousands of households, across villages and towns, across centuries, we see why cats came to embody more than their practical roles. They were companions in work and rest, symbols of patience and poise, guardians of sustenance and spirit. The worship of cats in temples and the association with goddesses like Bastet did not emerge in isolation, but grew naturally from these countless small interactions, from the rhythm of paws on clay, from the glow of eyes in lamplight, from the soothing hum of a purr blending into the sounds of a household settling into sleep.
When we move from the household presence of cats into the religious sphere of ancient Egypt, the texture of their significance becomes even deeper, more symbolic, and, to the eyes of many modern readers, even stranger and more elaborate than what one might at first expect. It is here, in the intersection of daily life and cosmic belief, that the Egyptian cat takes on a form beyond mere animal or companion, instead becoming a vessel of meaning, a living connection to gods and goddesses, a symbol infused with power and layered with centuries of ritual, association, and worship. And while it may be tempting to assume that this was all simply about Bastet, the feline goddess most famously associated with cats, the reality is, as always, more complex, because ancient Egyptian religion was never a simple linear system. It was sprawling, adaptive, multifaceted, and filled with contradictions that nevertheless coexisted without tension in the Egyptian mind. To understand why the cat became sacred, one must begin not at the grand temples, but at the small gestures of reverence, those subtle acts of devotion performed in the household, the marketplace, and the fields, which slowly crystallized into formal worship. The goddess Bastet, or Bast, as she was sometimes called in earlier periods, is the figure most prominently tied to cats. Initially depicted as a lioness, she later softened into the form of a domestic cat or a woman with the head of a cat. This transformation is telling, for it reflects how the Egyptians themselves came to see felines not merely as fierce protectors, but also as nurturing presences within the human sphere. The lioness aspect spoke of ferocity, of the protective mother who defends her cubs, of destructive power when provoked. But the domestic cat aspect carried different resonances: gentleness, grace, beauty, fertility, and the intimate bonds of the household. Thus, Bastet embodies the dual nature of cats themselves, both aloof and affectionate, both hunters and companions, both guardians and sources of comfort. To worship Bastet was therefore to recognize the cat as a reflection of divine duality, of the blending of the dangerous and the tender in one body. But Bastet was not worshipped in isolation. The Egyptians placed their gods in networks of meaning, often overlapping or contradicting without concern. The cat, for instance, could also be linked to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and plague, whose fierceness was never fully tamed. In this sense, one can imagine that when Egyptians looked at a cat, they did not simply see an animal, but a shifting symbol, sometimes the gentle household Bastet, sometimes the destructive Sekhmet, sometimes something in between. This fluidity meant that cats were never merely ornamental in the religious imagination. They were living presences charged with sacred ambiguity. Now let us pause, for it is important to note how Egyptian religion functioned. It was not a system of faith in the modern sense, where belief and creed dominate. Instead, it was about ritual, about practice, about doing the right things to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance of order, justice, and harmony. And so when Egyptians revered cats, they were not simply saying, "We love cats," but rather, "We recognize in this creature something aligned with cosmic order, something that connects us to the gods and helps maintain the delicate fabric of life." Even the smallest gesture, placing food before a cat, treating it kindly, mourning it at death,
was infused with a sense of participation in the cosmic cycle. The cat became, in this way, a miniature temple of fur and flesh, a divine node that linked human households to the eternal order of the universe. And then there were temples proper, dedicated to Bastet. The most famous of these was at Bastet, a city in the Nile Delta that became the cult center of the goddess. Here, festivals of extraordinary scale were held, festivals described by ancient historians such as Herodotus, who noted that they were among the most joyous in all Egypt. Pilgrims from across the land would gather, bringing offerings, music, and wine. And it was not only humans who were honored. Cats themselves were present in great numbers, revered, fed, and in some cases mummified as sacred votive offerings. Imagine the scene: thousands of people descending upon Bastet, the air filled with the sounds of sistrums and drums, women singing hymns, priests carrying statues of Bastet adorned with gold, while cats roamed freely through the temple precincts, their presence unquestioned and celebrated. In this setting, the everyday household cat found itself mirrored in cosmic grandeur, elevated from rat catcher to divine emissary.
But the reverence went further still. Cats were often mummified upon death, not only as beloved pets, but also as sacred offerings to Bastet. Archaeologists have uncovered vast cat cemeteries with thousands upon thousands of mummified felines carefully wrapped, placed in coffins, and buried. This was not done lightly. To mummify a cat required resources, ritual, and intention. Each cat represented a devotional act, a prayer embodied in linen and resin. Some of these cats may have been bred for this very purpose, serving as vessels of devotion in a religious economy that tied the physical presence of cats to the spiritual favor of Bastet. When one considers the scale of these cemeteries, the sheer number of mummified cats, one begins to grasp how profoundly the Egyptians saw divinity in feline form. The religious symbolism of cats was not limited to temples, however. In amulets, small charms carried by individuals, cats appear as protective figures. To wear a cat amulet was to invoke the goddess's protection, to ensure fertility, or to ward off misfortune. These were not rare items for the elite only. Amulets were common among all classes, which suggests that the sacredness of cats was a deeply democratized phenomenon. Whether a farmer in a mud brick hut or a noble in a decorated villa, one could carry the power of the cat close to the body, a small reminder of divine presence woven into daily life. The integration of cats into Egyptian religion also extended into myth. One tale tells of the sun god Ra, who at times took the form of a great cat to slay the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Here again we see the duality. The cat is not only gentle, but also a cosmic warrior, protector of order against the forces of chaos. To imagine Ra as a cat is to imagine the ordinary animal elevated to the highest realm of divine battle. And for Egyptians, this was not a contradiction. It was precisely because the cat embodied both gentleness and ferocity that it could serve as such a perfect divine form. Now, let us reflect on the psychology of this reverence. Why the cat of all animals? Dogs, too, were valued, often associated with Anubis and the guarding of tombs, yet they did not achieve the same pervasive sacredness. The answer lies, perhaps, in the very nature of cats, their independence, their poise, their mysteriousness. A dog will obey, but a cat chooses. To the Egyptian mind, this independence echoed the autonomy of the gods themselves, beings who acted according to their own will, not human command. To live with a cat was therefore to live with a creature that carried a trace of the divine attitude, aloof, inscrutable, yet gracious when it chose to be. This quality elevated cats into a realm that other animals, however useful, did not fully occupy. We should also linger on the role of gender in these associations. Bastet, as a goddess, carried connotations of femininity, fertility, and motherhood.
Cats, with their frequent litters and nurturing of kittens, became natural symbols of these qualities. Women, in particular, may have felt a special bond to cats, seeing in them a reflection of their own roles as mothers, protectors, and keepers of the household. In this sense, the worship of Bastet and the reverence of cats intersected with lived, gendered experience, reinforcing the symbolic web that tied everyday life to divine meaning. And yet, for all this reverence, cats were not placed beyond harm. In fact, the very reverence they commanded made their mistreatment a serious crime. To kill a cat, even accidentally, was an offense that could result in severe punishment, sometimes even death. Ancient sources tell us of mobs forming when a cat was harmed, the collective outrage of a community ensuring that divine law was upheld. This was not merely about animal cruelty in our modern sense, but about cosmic order. To harm a cat was to harm a fragment of the divine, to upset Ma'at, to invite disorder into the world. The seriousness with which this was taken underscores how thoroughly the sacred was embodied in feline form. Thus, when we consider religion in ancient Egypt, we must understand that cats were not peripheral symbols, but central, both in public worship and in private devotion. They connected household to temple, the mundane to the cosmic, the practical to the spiritual. To feed a cat was to feed a piece of the goddess. To bury a cat was to honor the divine. To see a cat stretch in the sun or purr softly at one's feet was to glimpse the quiet presence of the sacred in daily life. And so the line between religion and routine blurred until cats were not only part of Egyptian religion, they were part of Egyptian existence itself, interwoven so thoroughly that the two cannot be separated. And all of this, every gesture, every amulet, every temple hymn, every mummified feline, built upon the same foundation, the recognition that in the cat there was something more than an animal. There was mystery, beauty, ferocity, tenderness, and above all, divinity. The Egyptians saw it, felt it, and wove it into their world with a devotion so total that even now, thousands of years later, we can still sense its depth.
When we turn from the sacred rituals and divine associations of cats in ancient Egypt to their appearance in art and literature, we do not leave the world of the religious entirely behind, but instead step into a realm where daily life, devotion, and creative expression blend together into a tapestry of meanings so layered, so repetitive in their appearance across centuries, that one cannot help but marvel at just how central the cat truly was in Egyptian imagination. Egyptian art, as many have noted, is not art in the sense of personal expression as we think of it today. It is symbolic, functional, and deeply tied to ideas of permanence, continuity, and order. Everything depicted, every line, every pose, every proportion was intentional, meant to communicate meaning that would endure for eternity. In such a context, the inclusion of cats is never casual. It always signals something about status, about piety, about domestic harmony, about fertility, about the divine, or about some combination of all of these at once. And so, when we speak of cats in Egyptian art, we must understand that they were not simply depicted because people liked them, though they certainly did, but because they carried with them entire networks of associations that viewers would immediately recognize. Consider, for instance, the tomb paintings where cats appear seated beneath chairs. This motif, repeated across numerous tombs of the New Kingdom, may seem at first glance almost charmingly domestic. A cat curled neatly under its owner's seat, tail wrapped around its paws, eyes alert. But this image is not mere realism. The seated cat beneath the chair represents the order of the household, the quiet guardianship of the domestic sphere, the presence of comfort and companionship in the afterlife. The tomb was designed to be a house for eternity, and just as the living desired the presence of cats in their daily lives, so too did they wish for cats to accompany them in death. The repetition of this motif across tomb after tomb, household after household, reminds us that for Egyptians, the cat was not an optional presence, but a constant one, a figure so natural that even eternity without it was unthinkable. And if we dwell on this image longer, as indeed the Egyptians intended us to, we begin to see how the cat, placed in such a subordinate physical position beneath the chair, actually held a position of symbolic prominence, anchoring the scene, grounding the entire domestic tableau in familiarity and protection. Now let us turn to sculpture, another medium where cats appear with striking frequency. Small bronze statuettes of cats, often with elaborate details such as earrings, nose rings, or engraved collars, have been found in abundance. These were votive offerings to Bastet, left by devotees in temples, but they were also art objects in themselves. To hold such a statue, cold and heavy in the hand, is to feel the permanence of feline presence rendered in metal. The artist, though anonymous, would have carefully shaped the ears, the curve of the spine, the poised alertness of the body. These statues freeze in time the very qualities that Egyptians admired in cats: their watchfulness, their grace, their mysterious self-possession. And again, the sheer number of these bronzes, tens of thousands unearthed, demonstrates not only artistic repetition, but also the spiritual weight carried by these images. Each one, though nearly identical to the others, served its purpose: to multiply the presence of the sacred cat across the land, to ensure that wherever one turned, the feline form was visible as reminder, as protector, as symbol. Literature too reflects this fascination, though here the evidence is less abundant, for much of Egyptian literature that survives is concerned with hymns, prayers, and instructions, rather than storytelling in the modern sense. Yet even within these texts, cats emerge in symbolic roles. In hymns to Ra, for instance, the god is sometimes said to take the form of a great tomcat to slay Apophis, the serpent of chaos, each night. This literary image is vivid: the cosmic cat, claws unsheathed, eyes gleaming in the darkness of the underworld, striking down the serpent to ensure that the sun may rise again. To imagine this night after night is to imagine the ordinary household cat elevated into the grand cycle of cosmic renewal, its hunting instincts recast as divine battle. And because the Egyptians were a people who loved repetition in their literature, phrases repeated with variation, ideas restated again and again for emphasis, we can imagine how hearing such hymns would have reinforced, over and over, the idea that cats were not just animals, but sacred guardians woven into the eternal struggle of order versus chaos. Even in fables and lighter texts, cats appear. A tale might include a cat as a clever figure, outwitting a rival, or as a symbol of beauty admired by others. These literary appearances, while not as formal as temple hymns, nevertheless carried symbolic echoes. For the Egyptian imagination was not compartmentalized. Cats in myth, cats in temple, cats in home, cats in literature all fed into one another, creating a dense web of meaning that reinforced itself through constant repetition. If one saw a cat in a painting, one was reminded of the hymn. If one heard the hymn, one was reminded of the bronze statue. If one touched the statue, one was reminded of the cat curled beneath the chair. The circle of associations was endless, and through this endlessness, the symbol of the cat grew ever more powerful. And here we must pause to reflect on the aesthetic qualities themselves. The Egyptian artist was not attempting to capture naturalism in the way later Greek or Renaissance artists would. Rather, the goal was to capture the essence, the eternal quality of the cat. Thus, cats in Egyptian art are often shown in poses of composure, seated, calm, symmetrical, with ears pointed, eyes forward. This was not accidental. It was a visual shorthand for the very qualities that defined the cat's symbolic power: alertness, balance, serenity. And because Egyptian art thrived on repetition, these images recur again and again across centuries, until the image itself becomes timeless, outside of history, fixed in an eternal now.
If we think of literature again, we see similar patterns. Egyptian hymns often used refrains, repeating phrases in slightly varied forms to reinforce their meaning. And so too do references to cats repeat. The divine cat slaying Apophis, the protective cat of Bastet, the nurturing cat of the household. Each repetition was not redundancy, but reinforcement, building layer upon layer of association until the cat was no longer a mere animal in the mind of the devotee, but a living symbol, carrying within it echoes of every hymn, every statue, every painting, every tale. It is worth considering also how foreigners perceived this. To Greeks and Romans, the Egyptian fascination with cats was striking, even peculiar. Herodotus, in his accounts, noted not only the festivals of Bubastis, but also the extraordinary mourning Egyptians underwent when a cat died. To outsiders, such devotion might have seemed excessive, but to Egyptians, it was entirely natural. And this perception carried into art as well. Foreign visitors would have seen the cat images in tombs and temples, the votive bronzes, the amulets worn by ordinary people. For them, this was a striking cultural marker, something that distinguished Egypt from other lands. And so even in the literature of outsiders, the Egyptian cat became a symbol of Egypt itself, of its strangeness, its devotion, its unshakable connection to the sacred feline. Now let us expand still further, for the boring detail demands it. Consider the brushstrokes themselves in tomb paintings. Pigments made from ochre, carbon, malachite, and other minerals were carefully mixed, ground, applied to plaster. The fur of the cat might be rendered in pale yellows, in browns, in stripes, each tiny detail attended to with care. To the artisan, this was not only a task of decoration, but also of symbolic accuracy, for to depict the cat was to honor it, to ensure its eternal presence in the tomb. And so, if we imagine the artisan at work, brush in hand, kneeling before the plaster wall, dipping into the paint, carefully outlining the curve of a tail, we realize that even this simple act was itself a ritual, a devotional moment that repeated across generations. Thousands of artisans over centuries painting thousands of cats, each stroke reinforcing again and again the feline's place in eternity. And when one stands back, as the tomb's owner would have in life, the image of the cat beneath the chair or beside the offering table or crouched among the papyrus would be one of reassurance. For just as the Nile returned each year and the sun rose each morning, so too did the cat appear again and again, eternal in image, eternal in meaning. And if we shift to literature once more, the same eternal repetition is there. Hymns that loop upon themselves, stories retold, images layered. The cat was everywhere, always, never absent, always present, always meaningful. Thus, the symbolism of cats in art and literature was not an isolated phenomenon, nor a fleeting trend. It was a constant, a thread woven through the very fabric of Egyptian self-expression. From the smallest amulet worn by a child to the grandest hymn sung in a temple, from the painted walls of a humble tomb to the bronze statues cast in the thousands, cats were there, poised, silent, enduring. And because of this constancy, because of this endless repetition, the cat became more than a symbol. It became a presence, a reality that transcended the divide between art, literature, religion, and daily life. And in that presence, Egyptians found comfort, protection, beauty, and above all, a reflection of the eternal order they sought to maintain.
When we begin to consider the festivals and rituals of Bastet, the great cat goddess of ancient Egypt, we must slow ourselves down, because these festivals were not fleeting moments, not something that simply began and ended like the passing of an ordinary day, but rather long, drawn-out cycles of devotion, spectacle, sound, scent, and feeling, so interwoven with daily life and seasonal rhythms that to understand them requires not merely listing their practices, but lingering over their details again and again until one feels the texture of them almost pressing against the imagination. Imagine, then, the early hours of such a day. The sun has not yet risen, but the air already holds the weight of anticipation. Villagers stir slowly, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, adjusting their linen garments, preparing baskets, jars, offerings, and food to take with them. Some will walk, some will ride, and some will travel by boat, but all are moving toward a single destination, Bubastis, the city that was the heart of Bastet's worship. Bubastis was not just a place on a map, not just a temple, but a living stage upon which the divine and the mundane would meet. The great canals surrounding it reflected the morning light, and the temple itself stood tall and gleaming, its pylons casting long shadows, its walls catching the glow of the rising sun. To reach this place was not an errand to be rushed. Boats crowded the Nile, their sails catching the morning wind, their passengers already singing songs, clapping hands, beating drums. Herodotus, the Greek historian, though prone to exaggeration, described processions of tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, traveling together by boat, their voices carrying over the water, echoing against stone embankments, mingling with the cry of birds that skimmed across the river's surface. Whether or not his numbers were precise hardly matters, for the image itself speaks to something essential. This was not a small or quiet gathering, but an eruption of devotion and joy that pulled people from every corner of the land. If one pauses to picture it slowly, carefully, the details multiply. One sees women balancing baskets on their heads, filled with bread baked the night before, the crusts golden and firm, the smell still clinging to the air. One sees children clutching small clay figurines of cats, their hands sticky with the remnants of fruit they had eaten in haste before leaving home. One sees men adjusting ropes, guiding boats, steadying poles, their voices rising in songs that had been sung for generations, simple refrains that everyone knew by heart. And weaving among them, always, were cats themselves. Some carried, some perched, some darting between feet, their tails high, their eyes reflecting the morning light. The festival was as much about their living presence as about the goddess they symbolized. To attend a festival of Bastet was to enter a space where boundaries blurred, sacred and profane, solemn and joyful, human and animal, all merging into one. The rituals began formally, of course, with the priests and priestesses of Bastet leading processions into the temple precinct. They moved slowly, deliberately, their white linen garments gleaming, their heads shaved smooth, their bodies washed and perfumed, their hands carrying offerings of incense, flowers, oils, and sometimes animals. The sacrifices were precise, not hurried, each gesture unfolding as if stretched in time, and the chants that accompanied them were long, repetitive, and hypnotic. A phrase spoken once might be repeated a dozen times, not to bore, but to deepen, to push meaning beyond words into rhythm, until the crowd no longer thought about what was said, but simply felt its weight. This repetition mattered, because repetition itself was sacred. To say something again was to affirm it, to circle it, to wrap it in layers until it could not be forgotten. The incense smoke rose slowly, curling and twisting in the air, carrying with it the scent of frankincense, myrrh, and other resins, blending into a haze that made sunlight appear almost solid, beams of gold cutting through clouds of white. The people breathed it in, coughed sometimes at its thickness, but welcomed it nonetheless, for the smoke was a bridge between worlds, carrying prayers upward, bringing the goddess downward. And yet, as formal as these rituals were, the festival was not confined to the temple. Outside, in courtyards, markets, and open fields, ordinary people celebrated with equal devotion, though in ways that to us may seem more like revelry than piety. There was music,
Always music. Drums pounding steadily, flutes weaving long, thin notes, cymbals clashing, rattles shaking, and voices rising above them all. People danced, some in lines, some in circles, some alone, their movements ranging from solemn steps to wild leaps, but all driven by rhythm. Beer flowed freely, thick, sweet, and filling, brewed from barley, carried in large jars, poured into smaller cups, spilled on the ground when cups were raised too high or hands too careless. Bread, fish, and fruits were shared, sometimes offered first to the goddess, sometimes consumed immediately in laughter. Children played, chasing one another between stalls where traders sold amulets, figurines, jewelry, and charms shaped like cats. Some of these were crude, molded quickly, cheap enough for a child to afford. Others were fine, bronze gleaming, gold inlaid, prices high, meant for the wealthy who wished to carry a token home that would last a lifetime. And always there were cats. Bronze cats on tables, clay cats in baskets, painted cats on walls, living cats brushing against legs, climbing onto shoulders, leaping onto stalls, their purrs and meows blending into the sounds of flutes and drums. To walk through such a scene was to feel surrounded, enveloped by the goddess herself, as if her presence multiplied endlessly, echoing in every form, every sound, every gesture. One might think perhaps that such a festival was disorderly, but it was not. It had its rhythms, its cycles, its structure. Morning brought processions, midday brought markets, afternoon brought feasting, evening brought dances, night brought torches and songs. The light changed, the shadows shifted, the music slowed and quickened, but the flow continued. And through it all, Bubastis itself stood as a backdrop, its temple gleaming, its canals reflecting flickering torchlight, its gateways rising tall, its sanctuaries hidden but palpable. Herodotus described the temple of Bubastis as one of the most beautiful in Egypt, with a grandeur that set it apart, and while much of it has since crumbled, archaeology confirms at least fragments of its majesty. Stone walls carved with images of Bastet, columns rising like papyrus stalks, gateways wide enough to admit great processions. To enter the temple was to leave behind the noise of the festival, to step into coolness, dimness, silence, broken only by chants and the soft padding of feet. The contrast itself was striking. Outside, chaos of joy. Inside, order of devotion. And yet both belonged to the goddess. Both were her festival. Both were her face. If we look closer at the rituals themselves, we see layers upon layers of meaning. Sacrifices were offered, but they were not only acts of giving, they were exchanges, covenants, reminders of dependence and gratitude. Music was played not only for pleasure, but to echo cosmic rhythms, to align human life with divine order. Dancing was not only celebration, but embodiment, bodies moving as vessels of the goddess's energy. Drinking was not only indulgence, but participation, the sweetness of beer echoing the sweetness of Bastet's protection. Even laughter was sacred, for joy itself was her gift. And so when people laughed, when they smiled, when they clapped hands or embraced one another, they were not stepping away from devotion, but stepping into it more fully. Bastet was not a goddess of grim silence, but of warm presence, of the simple happiness that made life worth living. To describe these festivals in tedious detail is to do them justice, because they were long, drawn-out affairs, stretching over days, repeated year after year, remembered long after in stories told at home. Families prepared for weeks, sewing garments, baking bread, brewing beer, crafting amulets. The anticipation itself was part of the festival, a slow building of energy. And after the festival ended, the memory lingered, retold in conversations, carried in the figurines taken home, echoed in songs sung by children as they played. The cycle was unending. Preparation, celebration, remembrance, then preparation again. The festivals did not interrupt life, they were life, magnified, stretched, thickened with meaning. And through it all, cats remained central. Their images multiplied endlessly. Their living presence reminded people of the goddess in every corner of their homes. The cat stretched in the sun, the cat blinked slowly, the cat purred softly, and each gesture was Bastet herself, present not only in temples and festivals, but in the simplest of moments.
To love a cat was to honor the goddess. To feed a cat was to give her offerings. To watch a cat was to see her mysteries reflected in fur and eyes. The festivals of Bastet were not separate from these moments, but extensions of them, great mirrors of the small devotions practiced every day. And so, when we imagine these festivals, slowly, carefully, repetitively, we see not a single event, but a rhythm of life. Boats crowding the river, voices singing, drums beating, incense rising, cats weaving, priests chanting, traders selling, children laughing, torches flickering, temples looming, and through it all the presence of Bastet, felt not only in grandeur, but in simplicity. To attend her festival was to step into her embrace, to join in a celebration that was as much about joy as it was about devotion, as much about life as it was about the divine. And when one left, walking or rowing home, carrying amulets and memories, one did not leave the goddess behind, for she remained in every cat that purred, every laugh that echoed, every moment of protection and peace that touched their days.
We must linger further, and indeed we must allow ourselves to linger excessively on the festivals of Bastet, because to speak of them only briefly would leave far too much unsaid, and to leave much unsaid would go against the very purpose of this boring, long-winded recounting that is meant to unfold at a pace so deliberate, so unhurried, that each description almost seems to circle around itself, repeating and folding in upon its own words like a cat curling upon its own tail. If in the first portion of this chapter we looked at the general descriptions and touched upon the ways in which the festival was crowded, noisy, celebratory, now in this extended meditation we should take that same image and stretch it thinner and thinner, like pulling dough until it becomes translucent, so that every fine detail, every grain of flour and drop of water becomes visible. So let us picture yet again the boat journey down the Nile, but this time let us not rush past it. Let us imagine the creak of wooden planks beneath the passengers' feet, the occasional splash of water against the side of the vessel, the faint smell of river reeds, the glimmer of sunlight bouncing off the rippling surface of the water, and, as if that were not enough, the endless chatter of voices carried in the air. We may pause to consider how those voices might have sounded. Some high-pitched, excited, some low and grumbling, some filled with laughter, others with fatigue from the journey. And these countless voices, overlapping endlessly, must have produced a kind of constant hum, not unlike the background murmur one hears in a modern marketplace or in a crowded train station, though of course we must resist the temptation to be too modern in our imagery, and return instead to the ancient setting, where sandals slapped against wood, where oars dipped rhythmically in the Nile, where the air was heavy, perhaps even humid, and filled with the scent of fish and of people pressed too close together for too long. And then, as the boat moved onward, there would be the long hours, and then more long hours, and then even more long hours, because a festival journey was not quick, and one must imagine those hours dragging on, stretching time itself, with passengers fanning themselves, children whining with impatience, elders mumbling about the discomfort of the ride, and in all of this a sense of anticipation simmering beneath the boredom. The anticipation would grow, and it would grow slowly because that is how anticipation works. It stretches, it lengthens, it becomes tedious until the final release, and so too here we must let it linger. By the time the travelers arrived at Bubastis, the city of the goddess, they would have been half exhausted, half excited, and wholly ready for the flood of celebration that awaited them. Now once more, let us imagine the city. We must imagine it not quickly, but painstakingly, detail by detail. Streets bustling with vendors, stalls filled with bread, with figs, with beer, with trinkets, with amulets of Bastet. And these stalls would not have been clean or orderly. They would have been chaotic, messy, loud, crowded, with people pressing forward to buy, to sell, to barter, to argue. The smells would have been overwhelming. Smoke from cooking fires, the sweetness of fruit, the tang of fermenting drink, the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies. And all of this noise and chaos would have built up, becoming not simply a festival, but an overwhelming sensory storm. We must not skip past this, for this is the very texture of life, the very fabric of experience, and to glide over it would be to rob the scene of its density. So the crowd would move toward the great temple of Bastet, the temple that gleamed in the sun, the temple that stood as the heart of the celebration. And when they arrived, they would find music, and not just music in the casual sense, but drums pounding, flutes wailing, sistrums shaking, voices raised in chants. And we must imagine those chants not once, but again and again, the same phrases repeated, echoing through the crowd, phrases calling out to Bastet, honoring her as the protector, as the goddess of joy, of fertility, of the home. And people would sway, and some would dance, and some would laugh, and some would cry, because festivals release many emotions at once. And those emotions would mingle with the drink, because drink was plentiful, and as Herodotus noted, the festival was marked by drinking more than any other occasion, so cups were raised again and again, and voices grew louder, slurred, joyous, reckless. But here too we must pause, because what does it mean to drink in honor of a goddess? What does it mean to lose oneself in celebration, in laughter, in music? For the Egyptians, it was not mere indulgence. It was, in its own way, a ritual, a way of stepping outside the ordinary constraints of daily life, a way of letting the boundaries blur. And in that blurring, one honored Bastet, the goddess of both order and chaos, of both gentle domesticity and fierce protection. To drink, to sing, to dance wildly was not to dishonor her, but to embody her dual nature. Now let us turn to the sacred rituals themselves, which were interwoven with the revelry. The priests of Bastet, clad in their ceremonial attire, would carry statues of the goddess through the streets, or perhaps through the temple grounds, lifting them high, displaying them to the crowd. The people would cheer, reaching out their hands as though to touch the divine, as though to draw down her blessing. Incense would burn, and the air would thicken with its smoke, sweet and heavy, clinging to clothing, seeping into hair. The chants would rise and they would fall, and then they would rise again, an endless repetition like waves against the shore, and the people would lose themselves in the rhythm, in the sound, in the scent, in the sight. And if we picture this scene once, we must picture it again and again, for it was not a moment that passed quickly. It stretched across hours, perhaps across days, with processions, with sacrifices of offerings, with dances performed in honor of the goddess. Cats, too, may have been present, living symbols of Bastet herself, adorned with jewelry, perhaps carried in the arms of devotees, perhaps simply wandering among the crowd, their sleek bodies weaving between legs, their eyes glinting in the torchlight as night fell. And here we must pause once more to dwell upon the image of those cats, their fur catching the firelight, their movements graceful, their presence both ordinary and divine. To the Egyptians, these were not merely animals, but living embodiments of the goddess's essence, and so their presence in the festival was as sacred as any chant or offering. The festival of Bastet, therefore, was both ordinary and extraordinary. It was a time of drink, of noise, of laughter, of chaos, and yet it was also a time of devotion, of ritual, of connection with the divine. It was crowded, messy, loud, overwhelming, and yet it was sacred. And because it was sacred, it was remembered. And because it was remembered, we must recall it now, in all its detail, in all its repetition, in all its long-winded, drawn-out, over-explained imagery. And perhaps if we circle the description long enough, if we repeat the imagery often enough, if we allow ourselves to become lost in the endless flow of words, then perhaps we too may feel some faint echo of that ancient celebration, some faint trace of the joy and devotion that once filled the streets of Bubastis. And so we have stretched this description, and we could stretch it further, and indeed perhaps we must stretch it further, because to end too soon would be to risk brevity, and brevity has no place here. So let us once again imagine the crowd, and once again the music, and once again the drink, and once again the cats weaving in between the legs, and once again the priests raising the statues high, and once again the incense curling into the night sky, and once again the voices chanting, and once again the torches flickering, and once again the city of Bubastis swelling with life, until the repetition itself becomes a kind of chant, a kind of long-winded prayer to Bastet, the goddess who even now, thousands of years later, commands our attention, our patience, and our endless words.
We must remind ourselves that to truly understand the depth and breadth of the ancient Egyptians' devotion to Bastet, it is not enough to glance quickly over the surface of their practices, to summarize in a sentence or two the rites, the offerings, or the festivals. No, we must slow ourselves down, slow our minds, slow our imaginations, until each gesture, each sound, each scent, each movement of every living and symbolic creature in their world becomes almost unbearably vivid in its minuteness. For the Egyptians, life and ritual were inseparably intertwined, and to describe one without the other is to describe nothing at all, to skim the surface while missing the ocean beneath. And so, let us begin once more by considering the domestic life of an Egyptian household in which Bastet was venerated. For it is there, in the ordinary, the mundane, and yet the endlessly detailed, that the goddess's presence was perhaps most palpable. Imagine, then, a household at dawn, where the first light of the sun has just begun to spill over the horizon, catching on the mud brick walls, gilding the edges of rooftops, and glinting off the water in the nearby canals. The house itself is modest, yet well kept, its courtyard swept clean, its small garden producing herbs, vegetables, and flowers in neat, deliberate rows. Inside, the family stirs, each member moving with slow, careful motions, for they know that even the smallest action, from sweeping the floor to pouring water into a clay jug, has significance when seen through the lens of devotion. And amidst all of this activity, the cats move too. Cats, some sleek and black, some striped, some spotted, with tails held high and ears swiveling at every sound, their movements measured yet free, their paws silent against the stone and packed earth, yet somehow their presence dominates the space entirely, commanding attention and respect, even in their seeming silence. Each cat is watched, observed, tended, and yet allowed autonomy, for the Egyptians understood that their worship of Bastet was both ritualized and personal, both public and private, both formal and informal. Breakfast is prepared slowly, deliberately, for the ritual of eating itself has significance. Bread is broken carefully, grains counted, perhaps unconsciously, water poured into cups with measured steadiness, oil drizzled over vegetables with almost ceremonial care. The family pauses to observe the cats, offering them scraps first, for even in the most mundane acts, the goddess is acknowledged. One can imagine the repeated gestures, hands stretching, breaking bread, dropping crumbs, fingers brushing fur, cats purring in response, the sound soft but persistent, vibrating through the room, an undercurrent to all human activity. And as the morning proceeds,
preparations for the day's devotions unfold. Incense is ground slowly, the powder fine and fragrant. Perfumes are blended, small statues of Bastet are polished and arranged, amulets are examined for damage and repaired if necessary. Every small movement is both practical and symbolic, both ordinary and extraordinary, and we must dwell on each of them in turn. The courtyard becomes a stage for daily ritual. Water is drawn from the well with repeated effort, each bucket heavy, each motion deliberate. The gardener tends to plants with careful attention, trimming, watering, adjusting soil, inspecting each leaf for signs of insects or disease. Cats move silently among them, observing, sometimes stepping on roots, sometimes stretching against the sun-warmed walls, their tails curling and uncurling in rhythms that mimic the motions of the humans around them. We might pause to consider how often these small interactions were repeated, day after day, week after week, season after season, each repetition layering devotion upon habit, until the act of living itself became indistinguishable from the act of worship. And we must imagine this slowly, again and again, for only through repetition, only through over-explanation, do we begin to feel the weight of a single household's devotion within the vast sweep of a civilization's collective attention to Bastet. And as the sun rises higher, the household begins to prepare for the more public aspects of devotion. Offerings are assembled, bowls of milk, pieces of bread, small portions of fish, and perhaps a sprig of fragrant herb or a bloom from the garden. The offerings are placed on small altars or in designated spaces near images of Bastet. Cats naturally investigate these offerings, sniffing, pawing gently, sometimes consuming what is allowed and sometimes ignoring what is forbidden. Observing them is a ritual in itself. The family watches, adjusts, guides, and sometimes simply allows. Here is the subtle interplay of free will, devotion, and observation, all layered into the simple act of feeding. Each cat's reaction is noted, each purr catalogued mentally, each glance interpreted as a message, a blessing, a sign, or a reminder. The human attention to these gestures is painstaking, endless, and must be recounted slowly, repeatedly to convey the true weight of the devotion and the time it consumed. By midday, the household is fully engaged in the rhythms of worship and life. Children play, moving slowly or quickly, depending on the heat, their laughter rising and falling, mixing with the sounds of the cats, the swish of water from the garden, the soft thump of sandals against stone, and perhaps the distant murmur of the Nile and other households along its banks. Adults attend to tasks, repeated and repeated, polishing spatulas, mixing incense, arranging small ceremonial items, repeating motions that may appear redundant to an observer, but are essential in their accumulation of respect, piety, and attention. Each repetition is meaningful. Each small action is amplified by the long hours of patient, methodical, near monastic engagement. And let us imagine with care the midday meal. Bread broken into uneven pieces, fish cooked simply over a small fire, vegetables stewed with oil and herbs, all presented carefully. Cats are again involved, moving between human legs, receiving scraps and measured amounts, their eyes bright, their movements precise yet fluid. The family eats slowly, deliberately, mindful of every gesture, every motion. Conversation is measured, not rushed, words repeated in emphasis, in reassurance, in habit. And as they eat, They may discuss, again and again, the importance of the goddess, the proper conduct of rituals, the ways in which they have observed cats acting mysteriously, piously, playfully, or even rebelliously, and the ways in which those behaviors are interpreted, reinterpreted, and embedded in long-standing traditions. And after the meal, attention returns to the preparation for any communal rituals or processions that may be planned for that day. Perhaps the family is traveling to a nearby temple or joining with neighbors in a public ceremony. Boats may be readied, animals attended, songs practiced, incense packed, offerings secured, and throughout, the cats remain present, sliding between legs, climbing walls, leaping lightly from table to table, observing, participating, being, yet always watched. The repetition continues, checking the alignment of a statue, rubbing an offering, adjusting incense, reciting prayers aloud, then again silently, and then aloud once more. Each act is layered upon the previous, a meditation in motion, a devotion in time, a slow, careful stretching of attention across hours that, in our modern sense, may feel excessive, tedious, even exhausting. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was life itself, and the repetition was the very rhythm of living in alignment with the goddess. And so, as the afternoon continues, we may observe again and again the slow march of preparation, the repeated gestures, the layering of sounds, scents, sights, and motions, incense smoke curling in endless spirals, the click of sandals against stone, the soft pads of cats moving silently across surfaces,
The flapping of linen garments, the repeated tuning of small musical instruments, the repeated testing of flasks, the repeated polishing of small amulets and figurines, the repeated inspection of offerings, the repeated discussion of proper technique, the repeated glances to observe the behavior of the cats, the repeated mental cataloging of each gesture, each interaction, each nuance of attention, again and again, until the repetition itself becomes a kind of meditation, a kind of ritual, a kind of devotion beyond words. And so the day unfolds, long and slow, yet dense with action. Each movement, each gesture, each cat's motion, each small sound or scent is repeated, amplified, layered. Each act is over-explained, prolonged, intentionally drawn out. Each repetition is a link in a chain that stretches back into centuries, connecting one household to another, one festival to another, one generation to another, in an endless looping rhythm of devotion and presence. And it is in this layering, in this repetition, in this long-winded cataloging of detail that the essence of Bastet's daily veneration emerges, not as a single grand gesture, not as a momentary act of attention, but as a continuous, immersive, all-encompassing engagement with the goddess, with the cats, with life itself.
The sun hovers low in the sky, and the light shifts across the walls of the mud brick houses, stretching shadows long and thin, curling around doorways, climbing over rooftops, falling softly on the small courtyards where families have gathered, preparing yet again, carefully, deliberately, as they always do, for the rhythm of devotion that fills their day. The scent of incense lingers thickly in the air, curling slowly like smoke in a calm room, mixing with the earthy aroma of sun-baked clay, the faint tang of river water from the nearby canal, and the rich, pervasive odor of cooking fires where bread and fish are being prepared. Each household moves with meticulous attention. A mother lifts a small jar of oil and pours it slowly into a bowl, rotating her hand in a measured circle, observing the way the liquid pools, observing the way it reflects the sunlight, adjusting it imperceptibly, just enough to satisfy her own sense of order, her own sense of devotion, her own desire for perfection in the ordinary.
Children repeat small motions, some learned, some improvised, fetching water, arranging herbs, dusting surfaces, their motions deliberate, repeated, refined with constant observation, as if each gesture is a study in the act of living itself, each repetition another affirmation of attention, care, and reverence. And the cats, ever present, move between them, curling around legs, brushing against ankles, leaping lightly onto raised surfaces, their eyes glinting, their movements fluid yet careful, silent yet full of presence, a living, breathing embodiment of the goddess's gaze and approval, so that every motion of the household, every carefully measured breath, every repeated task is not only a human act, but a collaborative, ongoing ritual with the animals whose presence is inseparable from the sacred pattern of life. The repetition continues, endlessly, with no rush, no urgency, because time itself is folded into the rhythm of observation, of motion, of attention, and every act, from lifting a cup of water to arranging a sprig of fragrant herb, is measured, intentional, and observed, repeated, reconsidered, and repeated once more, layering devotion upon habit, habit upon devotion, until the boundaries blur and one can no longer tell where daily life ends and ritual begins. Across the courtyard, the sounds of the city echo faintly, carried on the warm wind, a low, constant hum that blends with the chirping of birds, the occasional croak of a frog near the canal, the soft swish of linen garments brushing against one another as people move from one task to the next, and the soft patter of paws against stone and packed earth, so quiet yet so present that it becomes almost a kind of rhythm, a metronome against which all other actions measure themselves. Each sound is noted, consciously or unconsciously, repeated in attention, compared against previous experience, memorized and layered, so that the day unfolds as a dense tapestry of recurring sensations, scents, sounds, movements, gestures, sights, textures, interactions, all intertwining, interlacing, folding back upon themselves, each repetition reinforcing the devotion implicit in every mundane act, until the very act of living becomes a meditation, a prayer, a slow, deliberate, and measured offering to the goddess whose presence permeates the space in both obvious and subtle ways. The sun rises higher, its warmth intensifying, and the households begin to gather for communal activities that will extend into the afternoon. Boats are readied along the canal, some small, some large, each carefully inspected, ropes adjusted, paddles tested, vessels aligned, and all motions repeated multiple times to ensure readiness, for even a minor oversight could disrupt the flow of the ritual, could ripple outward, affecting not only the participants, but the divine balance perceived to be maintained by the careful orchestration of human attention. Cats are observed closely, and their behaviors noted, a flick of the tail, a deliberate pause mid-step, a sudden leap, each interpreted for meaning, for guidance, for insight into the goddess's favor. Children accompany adults to the water, carrying small offerings, repeating motions of placing bowls or sprigs or figurines, observing the reactions of the cats, noting how they respond to motion, sound, scent, repeating these observations across minutes, hours, in cycles that fold upon themselves, building a deep understanding of the living patterns that reflect divine presence. As the boats begin to move, the slow current of the canal mirrors the deliberate pace of the humans and cats upon it. The oars dip rhythmically, creating a constant, measured sound that blends with distant chants, laughter, the occasional meow, the swish of garments against bodies, and the soft patter of paws against stone and packed earth, so quiet yet so present that it becomes almost a kind of rhythm, a metronome against which all other actions measure themselves. Each sound is noted, consciously or unconsciously, repeated in attention, compared against previous experience, memorized and layered, so that the day unfolds as a dense tapestry of recurring sensations, scents, sounds, Movements, gestures, sights, textures, interactions, all intertwining, interlacing, folding back upon themselves, each repetition reinforcing the devotion implicit in every mundane act, until the very act of living becomes a meditation, a prayer, a slow, deliberate, and measured offering to the goddess whose presence permeates the space in both obvious and subtle ways. Arriving at a larger gathering space, the participants disembark, moving slowly yet deliberately, their motions coordinated in informal rhythm, repeating gestures learned over years, placing offerings, adjusting attire, lifting small figurines, bowing slightly, raising hands in reverence, observing cats as they navigate the crowded space, noting each step, each glance, each pause. The scene becomes a multi-layered tableau, repeated across dozens of households, hundreds of participants, each action mirrored, echoed, repeated, multiplied, until the sheer density of motion, sound, and presence forms a kind of living mosaic, where the eye, if it could perceive all at once, would see both the individual and the collective, the ordinary and the sacred, the minute and the vast, repeating endlessly.
The central space is prepared for more formal ritual activity, and the sequence unfolds slowly, deliberately. Bowls of milk are placed on altars. Bread is broken into even pieces. Small animals are presented carefully with repeated attention to detail. Cats move through the space with quiet authority, brushing against offerings, inspecting the gestures of humans, leaping lightly from one surface to another, their movements repeated across minutes and cycles, almost ritualistic themselves, embodying the grace and vigilance of the goddess. Observers, in turn, repeat their gestures, carefully adjusting, placing, bowing, rising, observing, noting, adjusting again, repeating, layering motion upon motion, action upon action, in a continuous, unbroken flow of devotion that extends outward into the air, into the smells, into the sounds, into the textures of cloth, stone, wood, and fur. Music accompanies all these movements again and again. Drums, flutes, sistrums, rattles, voices, each repeated, cyclical, layering atop previous layers, filling the space, echoing across courtyards, along streets, over canals, blending with the swish of garments, the soft footfalls of humans, the gentle patting of paws. Repetition is constant, insistent, meditative, forming an invisible rhythm that guides attention, motion, thought, devotion, and observation simultaneously. Participants, young and old, human and feline, move within this rhythm, their gestures and motions echoing one another, over and over, until the day feels both endless and complete. A self-contained cycle of observation, care, attention, devotion, and subtle communication between all living and symbolic presences in the space. As afternoon gives way to evening, torches are lit. The light flickers across faces, walls, and cats, casting shadows long and thin, stretching across surfaces and folding back upon themselves. The smells of food, incense, and river combine in thick, heavy layers, each inhalation repeated in consciousness, remembered, layered. The music changes slightly, tempo shifting, though repetition remains, but in altered forms, faster or slower, higher or lower, varied subtly, yet remaining familiar. Movements are repeated as before, gestures measured, deliberate, layered. The cats, in their unhurried manner, weave through all activity, observing, participating, asserting presence, repeating behaviors previously seen, reinforcing patterns, echoing cycles, embodying the divine. Night descends fully, and yet the activity continues, repeated, layered, drawn out, until every act, every gesture, every sound, every movement, every repetition becomes an endless meditation on the divine presence of Bastet. The households return slowly to their homes, the boats drift down the canal, still repeating motions learned throughout the day,
eyes scanning, paws moving, hands adjusting, gestures echoing the rhythm of the day in endless reflection. Observations are repeated, lessons embedded, memory layered, devotion reinforced, patterns stored in mind and body until the repetition itself is ritual, and ritual itself is life, and life itself becomes a slow, deliberate meditation, a continuous offering, a never-ending presence of attention and reverence that mirrors the flowing, cyclical nature of the river, the sun, the moon, the earth, and the goddess herself. And in this endless unfolding, the rhythm continues. Movement, observation, gesture, repetition, purring, glancing, leaping, curling, incense, food, drink, music, hands placing, adjusting, bowing, rising, all repeated endlessly, layered upon itself, thickening, accumulating, until the day has stretched itself into an infinite tapestry of devotion, attention, and presence, in which human and feline, ordinary and sacred, mundane and ritual blend into a seamless, continuous flow of life lived entirely within the gentle, watchful gaze of the goddess, in which nothing is hurried, nothing is rushed, everything is repeated, everything is observed, and everything is reverently, endlessly, lovingly present.
The morning sun rises slowly over the horizon, spilling pale gold light across the mud-brick walls of the city, tracing the uneven textures of stone and clay, illuminating every small imperfection, every tiny fissure, every line left by the hands of builders long gone. And as the light stretches across courtyards and rooftops, it catches on the smooth fur of cats moving languidly among the humans, weaving between their feet, stretching against the warm walls, their tails curling in slow arcs, their eyes catching the sunlight and reflecting it in fleeting glimmers that dance across the surfaces of pottery, wood, and linen. And in this slow, deliberate unfolding of light and motion, we see the rhythm of life itself, the intertwined presence of humans, animals, and the divine, all moving in repeated cycles, gestures mirrored, behaviors anticipated, attention extended endlessly, layer upon layer, until the very act of observing becomes a meditation on both the ordinary and the sacred. Across the courtyards, the sound of daily activity rises gradually, soft at first, the shuffling of sandals against packed earth, the rustle of linen garments, the distant murmur of water from canals, blending with the occasional meow, the gentle pawing of cats as they move between legs and tables and low walls, and the repeated pounding of clay vessels being prepared, ground herbs crushed carefully with repeated motions, offerings arranged and rearranged, adjusted, checked, rechecked, until the human attention and the feline awareness converge in an almost imperceptible dance of observation and response, repeated endlessly, minute by minute, hour by hour, until the unfolding of time itself seems measured by the layering of small, deliberate actions. Breakfast is prepared in the slow, ceremonial manner characteristic of households devoted to Bastet. Bread is broken carefully, small portions separated, counted, adjusted, crumbs deliberately left for the cats, milk poured with careful attention, each droplet falling into its bowl with a soft, deliberate plink that is noted, consciously or unconsciously, by both human and feline eyes. And as the family moves through these motions, repeated again and again, their attention becomes both devotion and habit. Devotion embedded in repetition, repetition reinforcing attention, attention echoing ritual, ritual blending into life, until the simple act of consuming sustenance is inseparable from the acknowledgement of the divine. Children move slowly, carefully, imitating gestures of elders, practicing small rituals that will be repeated countless times over the course of their lives,
placing offerings, arranging small figurines, brushing fur, adjusting bowls, repeating motions with slight variations, observing the reactions of cats, learning to interpret the subtle cues of presence, gaze, and movement. Each repetition is layered, each gesture folded upon the previous, until the memory of the act itself and the understanding of its significance is embedded in muscle, in mind, in awareness. Adults continue their measured tasks, polishing statues, grinding incense, arranging ceremonial spaces, adjusting, checking, observing, repeating, and repeating once more, until the sheer density of layered motion and observation forms a continuous rhythm, a tapestry of attention that defines the household's daily devotion. Outside the courtyards, the city hums with its own slow rhythm, distant voices carried by warm winds, the faint sound of drums or flutes, the occasional shout or laugh, birdsong repeated across rooftops, water lapping gently against canal banks, all layered atop one another, echoing, blending, repeating, forming a continuous backdrop of sound against which the deliberate, layered actions of households unfold. Cats navigate these sounds, moving with deliberate care, leaping, curling, stretching, observing, repeating behaviors already noted, adding their own patterns to the auditory and visual tapestry, reinforcing the sacred rhythm of life in this city that is at once ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and sacred, chaotic and measured. By mid-morning, preparations for public rituals begin. Boats are readied along the canals, each vessel inspected repeatedly, oars tested, ropes adjusted, hulls examined again and again, ensuring readiness, while the cats move among humans, weaving silently, observing, sometimes interfering, sometimes simply existing as embodiments of the goddess's watchful presence. Small offerings are gathered, bowls of milk, bread, herbs, small figurines, flowers, placed carefully on altars or mats, adjusted, rechecked, replaced, adjusted again, repeated endlessly, so that every gesture, every motion, every repetition becomes both practical and sacred, ordinary and extraordinary, and the participants, young and old, human and feline, move through these cycles with measured attention, their bodies and minds attuned to the rhythm that has repeated itself for generations. The journey to the central gathering space unfolds slowly. Boats glide along the canals, oars dipping rhythmically, creating a constant measured sound. Passengers shift repeatedly, adjusting positions, lifting and placing offerings, observing the reactions of cats, noting every subtle movement, repeating observations across minutes and cycles, layering attention upon attention, motion upon motion, until the act of traveling becomes inseparable from the act of devotion, and the river itself seems to mirror the deliberate, repeated patterns of life unfolding along its banks. Upon arrival, the ceremonial space is already crowded, bustling, thick with sound, scent, and motion. Drums beat rhythmically, flutes wail, sistrums rattle, voices chant in repeated phrases over and over, creating a dense layering of auditory experience that guides attention and movement. Participants move slowly, deliberately, repeating gestures, placing offerings, adjusting positions, bowing slightly, raising hands, observing cats as they weave among the crowd, repeating motions already familiar, gestures mirrored, layered, amplified, until the sheer density of repetition forms a living, breathing tapestry of ritual and devotion. Offerings are presented to Bastet with careful, repeated attention, bowls of milk, pieces of bread, sprigs of fragrant herbs, small figurines, each arranged, adjusted, re-examined, replaced, repeated, until the human attention mirrors the goddess's own watchful presence, and the cats, moving through the space with silent authority, reinforce this divine observation, their own motions repeated, deliberate, graceful, folding seamlessly into the patterns established by the humans. Music accompanies these gestures, rhythms repeated, melodies echoed, chants layered over one another, forming a dense, immersive atmosphere in which every motion, every gaze, every breath, every purr, every scrape of a paw, every shuffle of a sandal becomes a part of the continuous unfolding ritual, repeated endlessly, a meditation in motion, a living offering. As the afternoon progresses, the layers of repetition continue. Gestures are repeated, music is repeated, incense burns and curls in repeated patterns, cats move through the space, humans adjust, observe, repeat. Conversations where they occur are slow, deliberate, repeated in phrasing and gesture, echoing earlier observations, reinforcing patterns, embedding devotion in both mind and body. Children practice gestures, repeating, adjusting, observing, learning the rhythm of life, the rhythm of ritual, the rhythm of layered attention that characterizes households devoted to Bastet. Adults continue their measured tasks, polishing, arranging, adjusting, observing, repeating, layering actions until motion and attention become inseparable, until life itself is a continuous meditation on presence, on the ordinary and the sacred, on the repeated layering of gestures that connects one generation to the next, one household to the larger rhythm of the city, one individual to the living pattern of devotion that spans centuries. As evening falls, torches are lit, flickering across faces, walls, and cats, casting long, curling shadows that repeat themselves across surfaces, forming patterns that mirror the repeated gestures of humans and animals alike. The sounds of the day continue in layered cycles, footsteps, purrs, rustling garments, distant voices, the soft slap of oars against water, the repeated whisper of wind through reeds, all forming a dense, immersive background against which the final acts of devotion unfold. Gestures are repeated, offerings placed, adjusted, replaced, incense lit, statues polished, cats observed, children practicing, adults guiding, all motions repeated, layered, echoed, accumulating into a single continuous flow of attention and care. Night deepens, and yet the repetition continues. The layering persists. The deliberate, slow attention stretches onward, weaving human, feline, divine, and environmental presence into a seamless, immersive meditation on devotion, on life, on ritual, on the slow, deliberate, repeated acts that define both ordinary existence and sacred acknowledgement. Every gesture, every motion, every repetition is thick with meaning, echoed across minutes, hours, days, seasons, generations. And in the constant layering of attention, observation, and presence, the living pattern of devotion becomes manifest, continuous, unbroken, eternal in its slow, careful unfolding as life itself becomes ritual. Ritual becomes life, and the goddess watches silently, gracefully, endlessly, through every purr, every step, every glance, every breath, every repetition, until the day, the night, and the life contained within them has been observed, honored, and repeated in full immersive detail, over and over, again and again, layer upon layer, gesture upon gesture, breath upon breath, paw upon foot, until nothing remains outside the encompassing, infinite flow of devotion and presence.
The night air is heavy with stillness, yet alive with the weight of centuries, and in that slow heaviness one can almost hear the echo of countless footsteps, countless voices, Countless gestures repeated again and again by those who came before, each of them layering their attention upon the sacred presence of Bastet, and each of them weaving into the fabric of tradition an unbroken continuity of devotion. When we reflect on this long continuum, we do not see sudden ruptures or abrupt inventions, but rather slow, deliberate, endlessly repeated patterns, where each generation learns from the one before, imitates its motions, repeats its phrases, and adds just enough of itself that the pattern continues without interruption, a living rhythm stretching from the earliest settlements on the Nile through the height of the great temples and festivals. The cats themselves, moving silently among humans, unchanging in their essential habits, yet infinitely varied in their individual gestures, serve as the clearest symbols of this continuity. Their every stretch, every yawn, every flick of the tail, a repetition that connects the present moment to the countless moments before and to those yet to come. To dwell on continuity is to dwell on repetition, and to dwell on repetition is to recognize the comfort it provides, especially in societies that sought order and stability in the face of natural cycles that could be both nurturing and destructive. The Nile flooded predictably and unpredictably, sustaining fields but sometimes overwhelming them, and so the people of the Nile turned to rituals and deities who could anchor their lives with meaning. Bastet, as both protector and nurturer, as fierce lioness and gentle cat, embodied the duality of life itself, and her worship endured precisely because she could be all things to all people. She could soothe in times of plenty, she could defend in times of danger, and she could embody the domestic comfort of the household cat while at the same time representing the unyielding power of the lioness. This duality, repeated endlessly in stories, in statues, in rituals, in festivals, in daily offerings, reinforced her relevance, her presence, her inevitability, until it became impossible to imagine a life without her shadow resting gently, protectively across it. When households placed their offerings of milk or bread before a statue of Bastet, or before the soft gaze of a living cat, they were not merely repeating empty gestures, they were weaving themselves into that grand continuity. The milk poured slowly, the bread broken carefully, the incense burned until it curled upward in long ribbons of smoke. Each of these motions, so small, so ordinary, carried the weight of centuries, for they were the same gestures made by ancestors, repeated faithfully, deliberately, layer upon layer, until their very ordinariness became the foundation of sacred life. Even the act of brushing a cat's fur, of listening to its low purr rumbling like distant thunder, became an echo of every hand that had done the same before, each repetition adding to the rhythm, each rhythm affirming the unbroken presence of the goddess herself. And yet repetition is never truly identical. Each gesture, each offering, each festival bore the subtle marks of its own time, its own participants, its own circumstances. The bread might be shaped slightly differently, the incense blended with new herbs, the song sung in slightly different tones or cadences. The cats themselves varied in color, size, and temperament. In this way, the tradition was both eternal and living, both fixed and flexible, both anchored and fluid. The people of Egypt did not worship a static ideal, they worshipped through living practice, through gestures that breathed with the moment, even as they echoed the past. In this paradox of sameness and difference lay the resilience of Bastet's worship, the reason why her presence spanned millennia, surviving changes in dynasties, in political power, in cultural influence, in external threat. Festivals dedicated to Bastet drew thousands to the city of Bubastis, and accounts speak of music, dancing, laughter, offerings, and feasting that seemed to stretch without end. To imagine such a festival is to imagine an overwhelming density of repetition and variation. The drums beat in relentless cycles, their rhythms echoing one another, building into layered waves of sound that pulsed through the crowd. Flutes and sistrums added their voices, repeating melodies, repeating trills, repeating rattles that mirrored the endless flicks of cats' tails weaving through the festival grounds. Dancers repeated steps, circling, swaying, clapping in time, their movements both rehearsed and spontaneous, both old and new, both inherited and freshly created in the moment. Offerings piled upon altars, milk poured, bread stacked, incense burned until it curled upward in long ribbons of smoke. Each of these motions, so small, so ordinary, carried the weight of centuries, for they were the same gestures made by ancestors, repeated faithfully, deliberately, layer upon layer, until their very ordinariness became the foundation of sacred life. Even the act of brushing a cat's fur, of listening to its low purr rumbling like distant thunder, became an echo of every hand that had done the same before, each repetition adding to the rhythm, each rhythm affirming the unbroken presence of the goddess herself.
and yet repetition is never truly identical. Each gesture, each offering, each festival bore the subtle marks of its own time, its own participants, its own circumstances. The bread might be shaped slightly differently, the incense blended with new herbs, the songs sung in slightly different tones or cadences. The cats themselves varied in color, size, and temperament. In this way, the tradition was both eternal and living, both fixed and flexible, both anchored and fluid. The people of Egypt did not worship a static ideal. They worshipped through living practice, through gestures that breathed with the moment, even as they echoed the past. In this paradox of sameness and difference lay the resilience of Bastet's worship, the reason why her presence spanned millennia, surviving changes in dynasties, in political power, in cultural influence, in external threat. The legacy of this worship would extend far beyond the temples of Bubastis or the households along the Nile. Even as Egypt changed, even as other deities rose and fell in prominence, even as new powers encroached, the figure of the cat remained a potent symbol. Cats continued to be treasured, to be mummified, to be buried with care, their presence in households a living reminder of the goddess's watchful eye. And travelers and outsiders who visited Egypt could not help but remark upon the peculiar reverence shown to cats, the way harm to them was unthinkable, the way their lives were interwoven with human households not as mere animals, but as sacred presences. And in this way, the worship of Bastet, though deeply Egyptian, resonated far beyond its origin, carried in stories and observations, in whispers, in the continued, repeated presence of cats themselves, wherever they wandered.
As the centuries passed, the repetition of gestures, the layering of offerings, and the endless weaving of human and feline lives together did not cease, but only deepened, extending across generations, stretching beyond dynasties, lingering even as new rulers carved their names into stone. The persistence of Bastet's presence lies not in the grandeur of monuments, though her temple stood tall, nor in the drama of military victories, though she was invoked as a protector, but in the small, repeated acts of devotion that defined daily life. A bowl of milk set out in the morning, a loaf of bread broken with deliberate care, the gentle brushing of fur, the slow curling of incense smoke rising through the rafters. All of these ordinary gestures, repeated across centuries, sustained her worship far more effectively than any decree or edict. And in this slow persistence, this gentle insistence, we see the true power of the goddess, not to overwhelm with force, but to endure through repetition, to persist through habit, to survive through the layering of countless small attentions. Consider the household at twilight, when the heat of the day softens into cooler air, when shadows lengthen and the murmurs of the city fade into a quiet hum. In these hours, families gather, meals are shared, and cats curl themselves against warm bodies or stretch across cool stone floors. Children reach out their hands to stroke soft fur, repeating gestures they will one day teach their own children, while elders murmur stories of the goddess, repeating words they themselves once heard in the same twilight glow. The gestures, the words, the stories, the purring, each a repetition, each a continuation, each an affirmation of continuity. In such moments, the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary dissolves, for the very rhythm of family life becomes the rhythm of devotion, and the presence of Bastet is felt not as an intrusion, but as a natural extension of the ordinary itself. This continuity, this seamless blending was reinforced on a larger scale through the great festivals, where the joy and laughter of thousands echoed the small joys of households, magnified them, repeated them on a grand scale. Pilgrims crowded into boats, row after row, their oars dipping into the Nile in endless rhythm, water splashing in patterns repeated with each stroke until the very act of traveling became a ritual. Songs rose from the decks, verses repeated, choruses echoed, melodies carried on the wind, all building toward the city of Bubastis, where the festival unfolded in a flood of sound, color, and movement. Here, repetition was amplified, offerings piled higher, songs sung louder, dances more vigorous, laughter more exuberant, yet at the core,
It was the same gestures, the same rhythms, the same cycles as in the quiet households. To feed a cat, to stroke its fur, to light incense in a modest shrine, these were the same acts, now multiplied by thousands, creating a living testament to the goddess's enduring relevance. And what of the cats themselves? Moving silently among the crowds, weaving between legs, leaping onto platforms, curling beneath benches, they were not passive participants, but active presences. Every flick of a tail, every slow blink, every sudden dart of movement was interpreted, watched, repeated in memory, layered into the experience of the festival. To see a cat pause and gaze steadily was to feel the goddess's gaze. To hear a cat's purr amidst the clamor was to sense the undercurrent of calm beneath the noise. To observe kittens chasing one another through the dust was to recognize the playfulness that balanced Bastet's fierce aspect. The cats were themselves rituals in motion, living embodiments of the goddess's dual nature, their ordinary behaviors imbued with layers of sacred meaning, repeated endlessly, observed endlessly, remembered endlessly. As night fell on the festival, torches and lamps flickered across the city, their flames dancing in repeated patterns, their light catching on bronze statues, on polished stone, on the gleaming eyes of cats. Music slowed, but did not cease. Rhythm softened, but repeated still, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the silence. Families clustered together, children drowsy, elders reflective, cats curled into warm bundles. Offerings smoldered gently on altars, the smoke curling upward in endless spirals, repeating itself in form as each ribbon of smoke was unique. In these quiet hours, worshippers reflected on the balance between joy and solemnity, between abundance and restraint, between the fierce lioness and the gentle cat. And in this reflection, as in every repeated gesture, the presence of Bastet was reaffirmed, layer after layer, endlessly. The legacy of this devotion outlasted the grandeur of kingdoms. Even as foreign powers came, even as languages shifted, even as temples crumbled and festivals waned, the cat remained a potent reminder. The image of the cat, sleek and watchful, gentle yet independent, persisted in households, in stories, in art. To stroke a cat, to listen to its purr, to watch its silent grace was to echo millennia of devotion, to participate in a repetition that spanned time itself. Outsiders who came to Egypt carried these stories with them, marveling at the reverence for cats, remarking on the unthinkable severity of harming them, spreading whispers of a people so devoted that even in times of hardship they would not abandon this small, sacred presence. And so the image of Bastet traveled beyond the Nile, not carried by armies, but by stories, not by conquest, but by repetition, until the cat itself became a universal figure of mystery, grace, and silent power. In the end, what endures is not the monument or the inscription, though these have their place, but the repetition of gestures so small, so ordinary, that they pass unnoticed in the moment, yet accumulate to eternity. A bowl of milk set out in the morning, a hand brushing soft fur, a voice repeating a story heard long ago, a child laughing at the playful leap of a kitten. These are the gestures that carried Bastet through centuries, that ensured her presence in every household, that sustained her worship far beyond the limits of political power. And in this lies a truth about human devotion itself, that the divine is not found in sudden revelations or grand declarations, but in the endless repetition of care, of attention, of presence. To repeat is to affirm is to honor, and to honor is to participate in eternity. So the story of Bastet, the story of the cats, the story of the people who loved them, who honored them, who repeated their gestures until repetition itself became sacred, does not end with the fall of temples or the silence of festivals. It endures in the purring of every cat that curls beside a human, in the repeated motion of every hand that reaches out to stroke fur, in the endless cycles of joy and comfort that cats bring into households across the world. The goddess's presence may no longer be invoked with incense and sistrum, with boats crowded on the Nile, with offerings piled high in bubastes, but she endures in the repetition of ordinary devotion, in the small gestures that echo those of millennia past. And as long as these gestures are repeated, as long as cats are loved, honored, and cared for, the legacy of Bastet endures, silent, graceful, eternal, stretching across time like the unbroken rhythm of breath, of heartbeat, of life itself, always repeating, always returning, always present.